It's amazing that in so few years, technology has gotten to the point where I can be as musical as I want to be using just digital gear. And that really is important because as I was transitioning from the idea of going strictly analog into hybrid, there could not be any compromise. And within this whole structure, it had to actually, there had to be a better reason than just so I could do recalls. I wanted to find something more that I didn't know existed yet, but there had to be something that could be bigger than the limitations of analog, as long as the sonics were still great. And that has always been the factor. There's cannot be any compromising. So at each one of these stages, it would take me forever to accept it because I had the mindset, oh, it can never sound as good as analog, and this doesn't feel good to me, and now I have to think when I do something. And so I was always kind of way behind the eight ball to my friends. But once I realized the power I had going into hybrid mode, where I was now depending more on the almost endless abilities that you could get through software, I could start doing things that I could never have done in the analog world. One of the quickest things, one most obvious, were the tools like iZotope, of how you could DS or you could fix, you could repair. Couldn't do those before. In the beginning, I almost used the plugins more as tools than I was using them as something musical because I had everything I needed behind me. But then as plugins became more interesting and more creative and more musical, I started using them. When I gave this, this proposition to Fernando, my assistant, saying, look, let's see what we can do to go completely in the box. It'll certainly help me when I'm doing seminars because trying to get this hybrid, half the analog and stuff, it just takes too much time. So I was thinking more of an educational point. I wasn't convinced any more than I was originally when the hybrid started that I could get something that sounded as good as I ever did with the use of at least some hardware. I wasn't in any rush. I was in my main room. Fernando was in the other room doing his stuff. And I said, look, just keep working at it. There's no rush. Let's do this slowly. And when you feel you're ready, when you feel like you can be mixing something, show me. And so he would come to me after a month or so and I would listen, I'd make comments. And again, my comments are strictly, I don't know, this doesn't feel as good. And maybe here's why. That's about as far as I got. And because that's all we care about. Does it feel good or doesn't it feel good? I don't care what problems or challenges you've got. That's going to be your problem. My problem is simple. I'll let you know when I like it. and he was like, fine. And he'd go back in and he would futz and I'd come back. And then eventually it got really, really good to the point where we even compared a hybrid mix to in the box mix. And that's at the point where we started, okay, we need to tweak this, we need to tweak that. So at this point, it's more use as an option B when I'm traveling to teach something. I wasn't really yet thinking about that I would have to be mixing records seriously for clients. But I wanted to get to know it a little bit, and so I would do it, but I wasn't really serious. Then comes along COVID, and we're all stuck at home, and I'm not going to be able to bring those 6 or 7 racks of gear down into this little space. I said, all right, here we are. I grabbed basically everything from Fernando's room, put it in my car, and brought it down here. And this became my room. At the time, I didn't even have any extra analog gear, except for my Binson delays and a couple other analog delays. That'll never stop. And I had my faders. And I had this fairly new template that I hadn't done much with, but I still had work. So I was like, all right, here we go. And not only was I trying to adjust to that, I was adjusting to a new room. Fortunately, it actually sounded quite good. And as the months went by, I started saying, you know what, that's a great template, but maybe we don't need to be so restricted to exactly the way it was when I was in a hybrid situation, or even back when I was only on the analog desk. And so almost every other day I would say, for now, this is our new default. And maybe I would change delays, or I would change some of my reverbs, and I go, okay, today this is the default. And then 2 days later, and I find myself liking something better. I didn't like what I had before. Fernando, this is our new default. There was no question that it would be okay if the sound wasn't quite as good. There was no compromising. At this point, I'm convinced that if I dig enough and I keep going, I'm going to find things I could never have done in the analog, and even in the hybrid, where I was pushing the ABCD to its limitations, because I had limitations of, the overhead. If a transient hit the overhead, I would like, I got to bring everything down. There was just a lot of restrictions that I was used to, and thinking, wow, what if I don't have those in this new world? And that became the case. And I just got happier and happier. And I think 3 or 4 months went by. And then one day, I'd been thinking about this, but one day I looked around, I was like, I have not even thought or missed all the gear that I've grown up with. I put my thumb behind me because I used to have 6 or 7 racks behind me. That was, and they were double-sided. It's like, I don't miss them at all. In fact, I'm kind of relieved. I can actually just get up and go. And yet everything I'm doing sounds just as warm and dynamic and exciting as it ever has. So I was like, well, this is it. I'm going to move forward this. And that's at the point where I decided, well, I'm going to sell just what I don't need. I still have some treasures that I'm keeping around, but it was at that point that I knew I could keep going and stay within the digital world, thanks to technology, thanks to the advancement on a, monthly basis with these great companies around us that allow us to do that. And we also, about the same time, we had TeamViewer and Audio Movers. Without those, I didn't have my assistant here. Fernando was in New York. I was here. Yet we were working seamlessly. And then I'd have FaceTime or whatever it is, Skype, whatever you have. He'd be there all day long. I'd be just looking at him as if he was in the other room. And he was hearing everything I was doing. And this was an opportunity for him to actually listen and watch me mixing for a year. It was a great opportunity for him. And at any point, if I'm trying to learn, because I didn't know much really about Pro Tools, I have to admit. So he was right there all the time. And then if I had an idea and I wanted to try something, he was right there, even though he was, 200 miles away. Had it not been for Audio Movers and TeamViewer, this would have been a very, very hard transition for me. But now, here's the part. For me, it's extremely boring. And anyway, I don't know how it was put together, but Fernando does, and Fernando is with me. And he's going to explain how this whole template came about. And I'm going to reveal pretty much the whole template. And who better than Fernando himself to explain how that came about and how the template evolved. So Fernando Reyes, my great assistant, who we've been together for 5 years. It's been a great experience. And because of Fernando, I'm sitting here mixing in the box happily, because he's way more technical than I am, but he's also extremely musical and understands how this important, how it has to translate. So at this point, Fernando, I'll let you take over and explain to everybody how the template works.
So I'm going to start with a little overview so everybody understands the general signal flow. When we receive tracks from the clients, the first thing that will happen is we will route the audio tracks into these folders. So for example, the kick will go to the kick, the snare will go to the snare, and these folders are preloaded with some plugins and sends that Michael likes to start with. They are also routed into the corresponding buses. The drums, you can see, are already going to B and to E through a send. The guitars are going to C. Pianos, the keyboards, the synths, the strings, the horns, the sound effects are going to A. Backing vocals go to A, but they also go to D with the widener through a send. The lead vocal routing is a different animal. We'll get to that a little bit later. The lead vocal wet and the lead vocal effects will go to what we call the V bus, which is basically just a routing thing because it's unprocessed. The lead vocal dry will be with no effects from the client, so Michael has that option, and the lead vocal wet will be fully processed to match the reference mix of the client, so Michael has the option to use either or to make a blend. All the ABCD buses are all summed to our master fader, so we can apply mix bus processing. The other processing we have in the template, like our delays, our lead vocal compressors, some parallel processing, and the reverbs, will also be summed to one of these buses, most likely to the unprocessed E. A couple of them go to A. So at the end, everything will be summed to the master fader. Down here, we can also see that we use a lot of VCAs. We use these to control all of the routing folders at the top. The lead vocals are controlled by the VCA lead vocal, the backing vocals controlled by the VCA backing vocal, so on and so forth. All of these VCAs are ultimately controlled by the VCA master, which is pre-ABCD. That way, if during the mix the buses are being hit incorrectly, either too soft or way too hard, Michael can control them with just one fader. They're also very useful if we need to listen to just the drum mix, for example. We can just solo all the drums with one fader. Or when we're printing instrumental a cappella passes, we can just mute all the vocals with a couple of faders instead of going through all the tracks. Another thing we do when we first get the audio tracks is I will evaluate the general level of them. So we won't mess with internal blends that the client has decided, but we will trim them all up or down. So if the tracks are too low, we will trim them up, and if they're too hot, we will trim them down. What I will do to achieve this is group all the audio tracks into this audio trim, which is also a VCA. So I will predetermine a good level for Michael to start, but also he can just adjust it during the mixing. This trim is pre all of the folders, which means that it will affect how the inserts are being hit. If the compression on some of the inserts are too hot or not enough, Michael can also adjust it with this audio trim. So we have two different points of control in pre and post different sections of the template. So the first 4 tracks we use are slate trigger, 2 triggers for the kick, 2 triggers for the snare, so Michael can enhance what the client has given us if necessary. The way these are routed is I have a couple of tracks down here. They are called kick trigger and snare trigger. I will just copy the kick track and the snare track here, and they're bussed up into here. And he can choose the samples he would like, and then he can also use any of the sends or any of the plugins from the template. They are already pre-routed with the drums to bus B and bus E. As you can see, we have the SSL plugin across all of our folders. This is to emulate the console that Michael has been mixing in most of his career. Because of preference, we have a couple of different models. For the drums, we've chosen the 4000 from Plugin Alliance because we really like how it punches. For the rest of the instrumentation, we have the 9000, which is more open and more airy.
And I love the low mid-range frequency setting, the little blue. That's exactly the sound that I had on my desk. In fact, that plugin sounds exactly like my desk because I A/B'd it, I tested it. Please move on.
Let me show you some of the defaults that Michael starts every mix with. The kick and the snare comes preloaded with a send to his kick punch, which we will get into, his boiler compressor, and the snare has its own snare punch and a Zener compressor. If we open the folders here, we also have the Motowns, which are actually his Motor City EQs, their hardware. So I will print them ahead of time because he always likes to use them. And then when he sits down to mix, they're printed. He can just bring them up with a fader. The toms come with the Kramer Pi. He used to have the original Pis in the analog world, so we've emulated them with the great Kramer Pi from Waves. The overheads have the Fatso, which he used also to have in the analog version, and we've created the exact same setting. UAD did a fantastic emulation, so this was very easy, just a one-to-one, put the same settings, sounds the same.
I've kind of got it on a set of warm, and so when those cymbals hit, it kind of holds out a little bit longer. It's just this beautiful flow and keeps it really, really clear, exciting, and warm. So you don't get that transient hit of a cymbal because sometimes it's not recorded all that well. And so the Fatso just really handles that beautifully. What kind of setting do I have on there? I got the bus tracking and the GP, and then I've got the tranny setting on there, and then the setting, the warmth level is at 4, and I usually hit it hard enough so that when you're looking at the compressor lights, it's usually somewhere between the green and orange, and that's when it starts to really wake up.
So when I'm prepping the session for Michael, I will play the overheads, and usually in the loudest chorus, when there's snare hits in the overheads, if it's usually around 7 of compression, is a good sweet spot.
Before Fernando shows the breakdown on the bass, what I've done for the bass for many, many years is I break it into 2 parts. One part of the bass is going to be the neck, and the other part is going to be the body. And I treat those completely differently. And the reason for that is that quite often, depending on the kind of record I'm making, there might be a need to just bring the bass line up, the articulation up, but you don't want all the bottom end to go up with it, right? So by having just the neck, I can bring the articulation of the fingering or the notes and just ride those up without having to try to do with some tricky compression or anything. It's just by hand. You're just riding that line and then back down. But then there's other times where you don't necessarily want that. Maybe up until chorus 1, you want less bottom. You want it just to be a little bit lighter, so when the chorus comes in, the whole bottom end of the record really comes in. I'll just bring that bass down until that chorus, and I'll bring it back up. Or it might be where there's a few notes without having to go into all the compression, which can be done. Maybe I just want to ride some of that low end on a particular note, or sometimes when the acoustic guitar starts the song and then the bass is playing underneath, but you don't want all that bottom, you really just want the top, just the neck. I'll just take the whole body, that second one, completely out. And so you have it just feels like a fat acoustic guitar playing. And it's very easy. There isn't any extra work. I just turned one off, boom, and I move on. And then when I'm ready, I can slide the second bass on. So that's the reasoning for always malting the bass. Fernando, why don't you break it down and see what I'm actually doing on those?
So bass 1 is the bass neck, as Michael was explaining, and he likes to start with the RS-124 from Waves. Back in the hybrid, he used to have the Altec 436 in there, but this plugin just works great to achieve the same type of sound. The bass 2 is the body of the bass, and we have the 737, some compression and some EQ, the exact same setting that he had on his. And here in the box, he really likes the black box. You will see it a lot on our template. So he also starts with quite a bit of saturation in the black box. Let me show you the two EQs we have in the consoles. On the left, we have the default EQ for the neck, and on the right, we have for the body. So if you look on the top left, you will see how the filtering is happening. For base 1, which is the neck, everything below 90 hertz is taken out, and everything above almost 10K is taken out. In the body, you have the full range down there, but you have nothing above 3.8K. We also have some compression happening in both instances and some EQ. For the neck, we're also taking out a good 6 dBs at 83 hertz.
It's a shelf, so 83 down. Some articulation at around 500, and again at around 900.
Good 3 dBs, yes. And for the body, we're adding a lot of low end, around also 80, good almost 6 dBs, adding some 200 as well, 3.7 dBs, and taking out some more top end at 3.8K, again in shelf, almost 9 dBs.
And hardly any compression, if anything. It's just letting a lot of it go through.
Now let me show you some of the default sends that he starts with. In the neck, he likes to send just a little bit to the 1176s, a little bit to the DIM-D, just to spread out those high notes a little bit more, a little bit to the Great Federal, and very little to the Senior compressor. Note that the neck is only going straight to B. It does not get malted into E.
I don't do that because I want it to be controlled. I want the compressors to hold it down, because B, I send to E, which is non-processed, so that low end is allowed to just flow through without limited amount of control.
So the bass body, bass 2, goes to the boiler, also to the Federal, and that's it. It's getting outputted to bus B as well as bus E. The breakdown of the neck and body is usually for bass guitars, when we get mono recorded bass guitars. Even if it's a stereo stem but it's mono information, we can mult it. But if we actually get a stereo bass where maybe they've recorded through some sort of chorusing, or they've added a widening plugin and it's true stereo, we're not gonna mult it. So we have this channel, which is just stereo bass, and it just comes preloaded with a 737, and it also goes straight to B and E. Nothing different about it. The acoustic guitars. The acoustic guitars are routed to C. They don't have any specific sends, but they all come preloaded with the black box again. And this is the particular setting that he likes to start with.
I have a lot of presets for every instrument. All of those, which I think are out. I believe I sent those out. Those should be available. So you can see that I've got some for like a more aggressive bass, or different types of guitar, if they're playing diamonds, or it's just a warm guitar. Because over the months, every time I do something to one of the guitars, I go, oh, that's really cool. That's really good for this particular type. I would just name it. And then down the road, next time I run into that same guitar, it's just a starting point, because you can see it's all in bypass. Fernando would go, okay, here's the guitar that he likes, and it's a diamond, boom, or it's a nice warm, boom. He throws that in there. And then at some point, when if I want to actually enhance that acoustic guitar, then I just, in 1 second, I can pop it in. I like it, fine. Maybe I'll tweak it. I don't like it, it just stays in bypass. And eventually I disable it. So it's like a starting point that is there for me, just because he knows how I like it. And it's convenient for me, because I've done many EQs, many different compressors. I just find that particular plugin just really just enhances beautifully what I'm looking for. So I tend to start with it if I want to, if the guitar needs it. I think one of the things that has developed over the past couple of years is that I no longer think about what am I trying to emulate in the analog world. I've become so comfortable with new plugins that are actually emulations of hardware I'd never had, never heard of, and I like it. And so I'm moving so much more into what's new, what's coming out that's exciting to me. If it sounds great and it makes something better sounding quickly, then I'm very open to the idea. There's absolutely no being set in my ways. I'm set in my ways until I find something better. I don't, and then if I like it, I like it. If I don't, I don't. It's that simple with plugins. It was that simple with hardware. You just because it's $50 or $100 or $500 doesn't make my sound any better because it's 500. If it sounds good, I'll use it. And if it doesn't sound good, there's at least, I don't know, 100,000 other plugins I could try, which is too overwhelming for me. So I only work within kind of a small batch. I even have a friend, when he'll start telling me about new plugins, I go, please, no, don't do that. No, I can't handle it anymore. And it's like, let's change the subject.
There is no default plugins for the electric guitars, but he does like to start with preloaded sends to his Edison widener, which is not really the Edison. That's what it was when he had the hardware. I kept the same name so it would be familiar for him when he's doing his sends, even though the plugins that I use to emulate that specific piece of gear have nothing to do with the Edison other than
the sound.
The sound, exactly. The other preloaded send is the Zener compressor. The default for the piano was actually an emulation of his piano chain that he had in the analog gear. He would always have a pair of LA3As, which were unlinked. And we have here the LA3A from UAD. If you can see, they are multi-mono and linked, so they can react slightly different to the left and the right. The other part of the chain that he had was this Focusrite EQs. When I first created this template, I can't quite remember what I had, but this plugin wasn't available, so we had to sort of use a different EQ that sounded similar. But as soon as Plugin Alliance came out with their Focusrite console, we jumped right into it. I emulated the EQ section to the EQ that he had. There's no compression going on or any gating or anything else. It's also multi-mono, and the left EQ is very different from the right EQ. So if you imagine a piano, the left hand, which has the lower keys, is EQ'd to sound with that weight, while the right side, which is where the right hand will play the higher keys, is more EQ'd to sound with more air and top end.
That piano sound is based, well, loosely at this point, but early on, I loved the Elton John piano shimmering sound, especially from the early Elton. That's all I could think about. Anytime I would be recording a piano, I would try to record it so that it would shimmer. And that's the first time I ever heard that word shimmer. When you would listen to some of those pianos, when he would hit a chord and it would just shimmer, and then you could hear the harmonics rising. Being the prime example is the first record I ever really recorded and mixed, Luther Vandross's Never Too Much album. You'll hear whenever a chord is hit, you could hear the harmonics rise, but I was also riding the faders up so you could really hear it. But I love that sound. So this setting is really based on that sound of bringing that up. And then in the EQ, I would usually bring out the 4,000 and 2,000 areas to really just accentuate all those harmonics. And again, it's really dependent on what kind of piano and what its performance is, what its function is in that particular song. But if it's really meant to be percussive and to be driving the song, that would be kind of processing that I would do to it. And also, I think we send it to one other different type of widener that, again, it's in name only because all of these sends are exactly the way they were on my console. So, it might not be an Edison, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm looking for the Edison because I know I want the Widener. But I had two different types of Wideners. One of them was the Edison, and the other one was a Portico. And so the Portico is generally across the keyboards, and it's a different kind of Widener, it's a different kind of sound, but again, it widens in a more subtle way.
So, like Michael just said, all the keyboards, all the synths, strings, the horns, they all get preloaded with the Portico send, which is the Widener. Moving to the organs, he loves the Culture Vulture. And we have different settings. So if it's a Whirly, we have a Whirly preset. If it's a Rhodes, it comes with a Rhodes preset. And if it's an organ, we have a general organ preset. The strings and the horns, the default is the J37. And even when we were on the analog console back at Electric Lady, this plugin was always across the strings just on Pro Tools. He used to use very little plugins back then, but the J37 on strings and horns, always a classic, and it's still to this day. We have a MHB Strings 2 preset and MHB Horns 2 for the horns.
And if you open that up, you'll see that I have presets for every instrument. So every time I find a new instrument, I get a cool sound, boom, preset. As a starting point.